Welcome to my channel, HFY Sci-Fi Stories. Like, subscribe, and join the human resistance.
They called us primitive, gave us a chair at the bottom of the room, and told us to be grateful. We smiled. We signed. We read 43,000 of their documents. While they watched empires, we studied locks. 72 hours of silence. Then one transmission shook 41 civilizations. Not a weapon, not a war cry. Something worse. We counted your failures. We mapped your walls. We made ourselves impossible to remove. They never saw it coming. Because they never finished reading our history. Earth's ruthless counterattack begins now. The chamber smelled like something old and cold, and not made for human lungs. Yara Osai noticed this the moment she walked in. The air had a faint chemical edge to it, not poisonous. The environmental team had confirmed that 3 times just wrong, the way the air in someone else's house is always faintly, inexplicably wrong. She breathed it anyway. She had been breathing wrong air for 11 years. A little more wouldn't kill her. The Galactic Council chamber was a bowl. That was the only honest way to describe it. A vast, sloping bowl of dark stone and pale light, with tiered seats rising in rings from the center floor. Every tier was occupied. Species she had memorized from files, from briefings, from the blurry long-range photographs that Earth's first contact teams had taken from a cautious distance. The Velhari, tall and silver-skinned, their heads narrow as axe blades. The Drun, four-armed, sitting very still in the way that something sits still when it is deciding something. The Sathari, who looked almost like birds and weren't, whose feathers, or the things that were not feathers, shifted color when they spoke. And below all of them, in the center of the bowl, 3 chairs. One for the council's head representative, one for the senior diplomat of the species being welcomed, one labeled, in 6 languages including English, vassal observer. Yara sat in the senior diplomat's chair. She was dressed plainly. Dark jacket, no medals, no ceremonial anything. Her government had offered her a uniform. She had declined. The people in this room would read everything she wore as a signal, and she wanted to send exactly one signal today, and it was not going to come from the cut of her jacket. The council's head representative was a Velhari named Sovareth. He was old enough that his silver skin had gone gray at the edges, and he had the calm of something that had watched many smaller things try and fail. He looked at Yara the way a person looks at a signature line on a form, necessary, unremarkable, a step in a process. Ambassador Osai, he said. His translator rendered it in flat, clean English. Earth accepts the terms of the Provisional Compact. Earth accepts, she said. Murmurs moved through the tiers, not hostile, not warm, the sound of a large machine registering a small input. Sovareth placed a document on the table between them. The Provisional Compact, 41 pages. Yara had read it so many times she could recite it in her sleep, and she had, in fact, done so, lying awake in her bunk on the transit ship while the stars outside were wrong shapes. She knew every clause. She knew the one about weapons development, capped at Class 3, which meant Earth could defend its own atmosphere and nothing more. She knew the one about resource allocation, which meant 12% of Earth's mineral extraction went to the Council's fund, a number that sounded modest and was not. She knew the one about observer access, which granted Earth the right to send representatives to Council sessions in a non-voting, non-deliberative capacity. She knew the observer's chair was called the vassal chair in the original Velhari text, and that the translation to English had been deliberately softened. She signed the document. The pen was a human pen, a cheap ballpoint she had bought from a pharmacy near her mother's house in Accra 3 weeks before departure. She had bought it specifically for this moment. Nobody in this room would understand why. That was fine. It was not for them. Sovareth took the signed document. He reviewed it with the particular slowness of someone who was not actually checking anything, but wanted the room to feel the weight of the moment. Then he looked up. Earth is now a protected member of the Galactic Council, he said. Your species will receive defensive designation, access to basic trade networks, and the rights outlined in Section 9 of the Compact. He paused. Congratulations, Ambassador. The word congratulations moved through the translator and arrived in her ear sounding sincere. She smiled at him. Thank you, she said. I have one question if the Council permits it. Sovareth made a gesture that meant yes. The Emergency Override Network, the one used to broadcast council-wide alerts. She kept her voice mild, curious, the tone of someone asking about bus schedules. Is the broadcast architecture still based on the Sathari Relay Standard? The documentation we received was from 14 years ago, and I want to make sure our observer team has the right receiving equipment. A small silence. Sovareth glanced at someone in the tiers. Yara did not follow his gaze. She kept her eyes on him, relaxed, patient, a woman asking a technical question. The relay standard was updated 8 years ago, he said. The new specifications are available through the Standard Technology Access Portal. Your observer team will be provided credentials. Perfect, she said. Thank you. She wrote something in the small notebook she carried. A single line. She capped her cheap ballpoint pen and put it back in her jacket pocket. In the tiers above, a Velhari junior aide made a note that the human ambassador had asked about communications infrastructure. He flagged it as a minor curiosity, gave it a routine priority rating, and moved on. The session had 40 more items on the agenda. He had a meal waiting. The document was signed. Earth was vassaled. The compact was sealed with the particular finality of things that large institutions do not expect to revisit. Sovareth looked at Yara Ose, the way the Velhari looked at everything they had already processed and categorized and filed. You understand, he said, and his translator gave the words a gentle quality, almost kind, that this arrangement is designed for the protection of younger species. Earth is not yet equipped, strategically or technologically, for full membership. This is not a judgment. It is simply a matter of development. Of course, Yara said. Many species have walked this path. The Drun were protected members for 60 years before achieving full status, the Harathi for 90. He folded his long hands on the table. There is no shame in it. None at all, she agreed. She meant it. There was no shame in it. Shame was not the thing she was carrying out of this room. She stood, shook hands. The Velhari had learned human handshakes as a courtesy gesture, and executed them with the careful precision of someone doing a thing they found slightly strange, and walked back through the chamber. At the door, she did not look back. Behind her, the council moved on to the next agenda item. In the transit shuttle back to the human diplomatic vessel, she opened the notebook. The single line she had written read: Relay update 8 years, specs in portal, access on arrival. Below it, in smaller writing that she had written before she ever entered the chamber: Day 0 clock starts now. She closed the notebook. Outside the shuttle window, the council station hung enormous against the dark, ringed with lights, studded with the ships of 41 species, old and massive and absolutely certain of itself. Yara Ose looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at her hands. The cheap ballpoint pen had left a faint ink smear on the side of her index finger. She rubbed it with her thumb. It didn't fully go away. She left it. The shuttle docked. She stepped aboard the human vessel. Down the corridor, past the diplomatic staff who were still processing the day's formality, she found the small, locked room that only she and 4 other people on Earth knew existed. She sat at the desk inside. She opened a secured channel. Day 0, she said into it. On the other end, 11 years of quiet preparation, in laboratories, in server rooms, in warehouses on 3 continents, in the heads of people who had been selected specifically because they were patient, started its clock. She sat alone in the small room for a long time after the channel closed. The air still smelled wrong. She breathed it anyway. The humans were very good at looking like they were learning. This was the first thing Admiral Vethsoren of the Velhari Security Directorate noticed about them, 8 months into Earth's observer period. They came to every session. They sat in their designated tier, the observer level, 2 rows below full member seating, above the visitor gallery, a position designed to be exactly significant enough to feel like participation and exactly limited enough to mean nothing. They took notes. They asked polite, procedural questions through proper channels. They submitted their quarterly compliance reports on time and in the correct format, which was more than could be said for the Harathi, who had been full members for 30 years and still filed late. They seemed grateful. That was the word his aide used in an early report. The human observers seemed genuinely grateful for access. Vethsoren had noted it, approved the report, and moved on. 8 months later, sitting in his office at 3 in the morning with a cold drink and an uncomfortable feeling he could not fully name, he pulled the file back up. Grateful, he read the word again. He had dealt with many species in his 40 years with the Directorate. He had dealt with the Drun, who were proud and did not hide it. He had dealt with the Sathari, who were political in every interaction down to the angle of their feathers. He had dealt with species who were bitter about protected status, who were relieved by it, who were confused by it, who simply did not understand the structure of the council well enough to feel anything specific about it. He had never dealt with a species that seemed genuinely, quietly grateful. He thought about that. Then he pulled up the access logs for the Council's General Technology Portal. Observer class credentials allowed access to non-classified infrastructure documentation. Standard practice. Every protected species got the same package. Nobody ever read most of it. He ran a search filter on the Human Observer team's access history. The search took 11 seconds to return results. He stared at the results for considerably longer. In 8 months, the Human Observer team, 5 people, rotating in shifts, always exactly 5, had accessed 43,812 documents. For reference, the Harathi Observer team in their first year of protected status had accessed 61 documents. The Drun had accessed 240. The previous record for Observer Portal access in the first year of protected membership had been held by the Sathari, who were famously thorough, at 4,100 documents. The humans had accessed 43,000. Vethsoren set down his drink. He thought about going back to sleep. He thought about how this could be nothing, an automated indexing process, a cataloging system, a simple administrative error in the logs. He thought about the ambassador's question in the opening session, the question about relay standards, the mild, bus schedule tone of it. He drafted a report to the Security Directorate at 4 in the morning. He flagged it Priority 2 out of 5. Priority 1 was reserved for active threats. Priority 2 was for things that were probably nothing but warranted watching. He sent it. He went to sleep. The report entered the Directorate's queue at 4:17 a.m. The queue contained 842 items. The Directorate processed items by priority and age. Priority 2 items moved when Priority 1 items allowed it. There were 14 Priority 1 items ahead of it. The report sat in the queue and waited. The human observer at that particular moment was a man named Dara Sinclair. He was 29 years old, had degrees in computer systems and xenolinguistics, and had been selected for the Observer program after 3 years of a vetting process that had looked, from the outside, like a very rigorous academic fellowship. He was sitting in the Observer tier during a council session about trade route taxation that had been running for 4 hours and showed no signs of resolution. He was not listening to the taxation debate. He had a standard-issue Observer tablet on his knee. The screen, to anyone glancing from above, showed the session transcript updating in real time. Below the transcript window, in a minimized panel that would have required someone to physically stand over his shoulder and look closely to notice, was a mapping interface. He was cross-referencing the relay tower placement data he had accessed in the portal with the session seeding records to build a signal propagation model of the chamber itself. It was not exciting work. It was the kind of work that made sense only as a tiny piece of a much larger thing. He had been told this from the beginning, by Ambassador Osa herself, in a meeting that had felt less like a briefing and more like a conversation between people who had been waiting a long time to start doing something. "You are not going to understand what you're building," she had told the observer team on their first day. "None of us will see the whole picture. That's not a problem. The picture exists whether or not any one of us can see it." Dara had asked, "What are we building?" She had looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who already knows the answer and is deciding how much of it to give away. "Leverage," she said. "Every document you read is a brick. Every question you ask through proper channels is a brick. You're going to be very polite and very curious and very, very thorough, and at the end of it we're going to have a building." He had nodded. He had understood that it was not the kind of thing you asked follow-up questions about. So he read documents. He asked polite questions. He attended sessions about taxation disputes and resource allocation and the maintenance schedules for council-managed relay stations, especially the relay stations. And he logged everything in a format that the team back on Earth had been using for the full 8 months, in the rooms that did not appear on any official schematic. The Velhari Admiral's Priority 2 report reached an analyst named Cho Metha on a Tuesday afternoon. She read it. She pulled the portal access logs herself and confirmed the numbers. She sat with it for a while. Then she wrote a note recommending escalation to Priority 1 and sent it back up the chain. The escalation request sat in a supervisor's inbox for 3 days. The supervisor was managing an actual Priority 1 situation involving an armed dispute between 2 full member species over a mining claim, which was political and loud, and consumed most of his attention. On the 4th day, he approved the escalation. The report was reclassified Priority 1. An action order was drafted. It would require Council security to audit the human observer's access history, flag the specific document categories, and potentially restrict observer portal credentials pending review. The action order was routed to Council Security's scheduling office. Earth had 72 hours before that order reached someone who would act on it. Yara Os received the notification through a channel she was not supposed to have and did not officially possess. She had built it herself in small pieces over 14 months. It was made of publicly available infrastructure, accessed through credentials that were entirely legitimate, assembled in a configuration that nobody in the council had thought to prohibit because nobody had thought anyone would think to build it. She read the notification for approximately 4 seconds. She sent one message back to Earth: "Close the windows." Within 6 hours, every human observer team in every council facility had completed their assigned access, logged out of the portal cleanly and completely, and begun the normal end-of-rotation administrative procedures that preceded a standard team recall. Nobody ran. Nobody looked hurried. They filed their final session reports. They thanked their Velhari liaison officers. One of them left a small box of individually wrapped chocolates on the desk of the administrative coordinator who had helped them navigate the filing system. The coordinator would later recall this as a very thoughtful gesture. All 5 observers boarded their scheduled transport. The transport left on time. 14 months of questions, 43,812 documents, 411 polite inquiries, 6 careful conversations with infrastructure technicians who had been flattered by the interest and seen no reason to be careful. All of it arrived home in compressed files and handwritten notes, and the heads of people who had been selected specifically, because they could carry information without looking like they were carrying anything at all. 3 days later, Earth closed its ports. The Council's action order reached the scheduling office on a Wednesday morning. By then, the thing it was meant to stop had already happened. For 72 hours, Earth said nothing. No ships left. No communications were answered. The standard diplomatic channels produced silence. The emergency contact protocols, which Earth was technically required to respond to within 6 hours as a condition of the provisional compact, went unanswered. When the Council's communication team sent a formal inquiry, it received an automated response stating that Earth's diplomatic systems were undergoing scheduled maintenance and would resume normal operations shortly. No maintenance window had been filed. The Council's first assumption was technical failure. These things happened with younger species. Their infrastructure was not always reliable. Their administrative processes sometimes lagged. A Velhari technical team was dispatched to run a remote diagnostic on Earth's registered communication relays. The relays were online. They were receiving transmissions. They simply were not transmitting back. The Council's second assumption was internal crisis, political disruption, a change in government, some kind of domestic instability that had temporarily paralyzed their diplomatic function. This was documented. It had happened before with other species. It was inconvenient but manageable. An analyst pulled Earth's news feeds publicly accessible, not restricted, and found nothing indicating crisis. The feeds showed ordinary news, weather, sports, a story about a new transit line opening in a city called Nairobi, a cooking competition, an argument in one of their national legislatures about water infrastructure funding. Nothing that looked like panic, nothing that looked like collapse. The 72 hours passed. On the morning of the 73rd hour, a broadcast arrived from Earth. It was addressed to all 41 member species of the Galactic Council simultaneously. It used the Council's own emergency relay network, the one that had been updated 8 years ago, the specifications for which were available through the standard technology access portal. It bypassed the standard diplomatic submission process and arrived directly in the primary communication channel of every Council member's government office, tagged with the emergency priority flag that was reserved for Council-level alerts. The broadcast was not a declaration of war. It was a document, 47 pages, titled in plain text in all 6 Council languages simultaneously. A full account of services rendered, resources extracted, and liabilities incurred under the provisional compact between Earth and the Galactic Council, with interest calculated at standard commercial rates. The document was, in every structural sense, an invoice. Page 1 was an introduction. It stated, in calm and direct language, that Earth had reviewed the terms of the provisional compact and found that the exchange had not been balanced. It stated that the Council had received substantial value from Earth's participation in the compact value that had not been formally recognized or compensated. It stated that this document was a record of that value, presented in the interest of transparency and fair dealing. Page 2 began the line items. The first section covered mineral resources. 12% of Earth's annual extraction, as required by the compact, had been delivered to the Council's resource fund over 14 months. The document listed every shipment, every tonnage, every material type. Against each item, it listed the current market value in Council standard currency. Then it listed the value of those same materials in the emerging secondary markets that Earth had, during its observer period, quietly identified and mapped markets where certain rare earth elements commanded prices 3 to 4 times higher than the Council's standard rates. The difference between what Earth had delivered and what that delivery was actually worth, calculated at the higher rate, ran to a number that required 11 digits. That was the first section. The second section covered technology access. The compact had granted Earth access to basic trade networks and standard infrastructure documentation. The document itemized what Earth had not been given access to: classified terraforming data, advanced propulsion research, medical technology that had been applied to 3 Council member species but not shared with protected members, and placed a value on each gap based on Earth's own development costs for equivalent technology, which the document noted Earth had already begun developing independently. The third section was simply titled Asterisk Losses Attributable to Delayed Access. It listed, in careful detail, 12 diseases that had continued to kill humans during the 14 months of protected status. Against each one, it noted that a Council standard treatment had existed for decades, and had not been included in the protected member benefits package because it was classified above basic access level. Against each disease, it listed an estimated number of human deaths during the observer period. The list was a page and a half long. The numbers in this section were not given a monetary value. The document simply presented them. No commentary, no language about tragedy or injustice or suffering, just names of diseases and numbers of dead in the same plain font as the mineral tallies, which was somehow worse than any emotional language could have been. The fourth section was where the document stopped being an invoice and became something else. It was titled Infrastructure Dependencies, Addendum. It listed, with full technical citation from the Council's own publicly available documentation, 17 critical systems in the Council's shared infrastructure that had, over the past 14 months, developed operational dependencies on technology and processes that Earth had introduced, in some cases directly, as part of observer period technical exchanges, and in some cases indirectly, through the secondary market networks that Council member species had adopted because they were cheaper and faster, and nobody had thought to ask where they originated. The relay network was on the list. The updated relay network, the one that was now the Council's primary emergency broadcast system, used a signal compression algorithm that had been submitted to the General Technology Exchange by a human-affiliated research firm 14 months ago and adopted by the Sathari relay engineers because it was 31% more efficient than the existing standard. The algorithm was not patented under Council law because Earth had not yet had full member access to file patents, but the algorithm was, the document noted, Earth's intellectual property under every relevant legal framework, and the document reserved all rights to its continued use. 15 of the 17 listed systems had similar footnotes. The document ended with 3 paragraphs. The first stated that Earth was not making demands at this time. Earth was presenting facts. The second stated that Earth would resume normal diplomatic communications within 48 hours and looked forward to a productive conversation about revised terms. The third paragraph was one sentence. We have been good students. In the Council's Communications Center, the analyst who had flagged the portal access logs 3 weeks earlier read the document twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Her supervisor appeared in the doorway. "Is it a declaration of war?" he asked. He looked like someone who had been hopping it was a declaration of war, because a declaration of war was a known thing with known responses. "No," she said. "Then what is it?" She thought about the 43,812 documents. She thought about the chocolates left on the desk. She thought about a human ambassador asking a mild, bus schedule question about relay standards on the day she signed a treaty that everyone in the room had believed was the end of the conversation. "A report card," she said. "They're giving us a report card." Her supervisor looked at her. "And we failed," she added. She forwarded the document to the Security Council with a priority 1 flag. Then she forwarded it to every member species' primary government channel personally, with a note that read, "You've already received this. I recommend reading Section 3 before you respond to anything." She sat alone at her desk in the hum of the communication center and thought about a species that had looked, for 14 months, like it was learning to fit into a shape someone else had made for it. She thought about what that actually required. Patience, precision, the particular kind of cold-blooded focus that comes not from aggression but from having decided, a long time ago, exactly what you are going to do and being willing to wait as long as it takes to do it correctly. She thought we called them procedurally sophisticated but strategically naive. She thought we wrote that in a report. Outside the station, the stars held their places. The council's lights burned steady and bright as they always had. Everything looked the same as it had 73 hours ago. Nothing was. The emergency session was called for the following morning. By the time the first representatives arrived, 3 of them had already sent private messages to Earth's diplomatic address requesting clarification. One had sent a message requesting a bilateral conversation before the session. One had sent a message that was technically a formal protest but read more like a question. The Sathari delegation had sent nothing, which their liaison officer privately noted was unusual. The Sathari always sent something. The chamber filled quickly. The normal seating arrangement placed full member species by their council seniority, in rings descending toward the center floor, with the presiding seat reserved for the current council chair, who was, this cycle, a drun named Avaharan. She took her seat at the center with 4 arms folded, which meant something in drun body language that her aide had translated for the human observer team 14 months ago as approximately "I would like this to be over before it begins." The observer tier was empty. This was noticed. The observer tier was always occupied when sessions were called. The fact of its emptiness was louder than it had any right to be. Avaharan opened the session. "The Council has received a communication from Earth," she said. "Representatives have had access to the document for the past 18 hours. This session is called to determine a collective response." What followed was, depending on one's tolerance for watching powerful institutions argue, either fascinating or exhausting. The Velhari wanted to know how Earth had accessed the emergency broadcast system. This was, they pointed out, a serious breach of the observer access protocols. The document had been transmitted on a priority channel that protected members were not authorized to use. This was the issue, they said, not the contents of the document, the method. The drun said the method was less interesting than the contents, specifically Section 4. The Velhari said the contents could not be evaluated without first establishing the legitimacy of the transmission. The drun said the transmission was sitting in everyone's inbox and evaluating. It seemed fairly straightforward regardless of how it arrived. The Velhari said. The Harathi interrupted. The Harathi were old enough in their council membership to interrupt without causing a formal incident, and their senior representative, a compact and deliberate figure named Yos Thurin, did not raise her voice. She simply began speaking, and the chamber quieted around her the way things quiet around someone who does not often choose to speak. "The relay algorithm," she said. "Section 4, Item 3. The signal compression algorithm currently running our emergency broadcast network. When was this adopted?" A technical aide in the upper tier confirmed. 14 months ago, following an upgrade cycle. And who filed the technology exchange submission that introduced it? The aide checked records. A research firm registered under Earth's Observer Period credentials, Bluewater Systems. Is that firm known to the Council's technology office? The aide checked. No independent flag, standard submission, past efficiency review, adopted at the discretion of the Relay Technical Board. Yos Thurin folded her hands. So we adopted a critical communications algorithm from a human firm, without a patent review, during the period when we had classified Earth as a protected vassal species too underdeveloped for full membership. The aide said nothing. And we are now receiving a message on that same system, she said, from that same species, informing us that the algorithm is their intellectual property and they reserve rights to its continued use. The chamber was quiet. I am not arguing about the transmission method, Yozthuren said. She looked at the Velhari representative without particular hostility. I am nodding that the transmission method is, itself, part of the argument being made. The argument about whether to treat the document as a formal legal claim, a political statement, or a protocol violation continued for 2 hours. It was the kind of argument that happens when nobody wants to say the obvious thing, so everyone argues around it at great length and volume, hoping someone else will say it first. The Sithari spoke only once, early in the session. Their senior representative, Soliveth, whose feathers had stayed a flat, unreadable gray throughout, said this: "We should determine what Earth wants before we determine how to respond to how they asked for it." The Velhari said Earth's demands were not yet formally stated. Soliveth said that was also part of the argument being made. Then the Sithari went quiet again and stayed that way. The session ground through lunch. Avaharan called a recess. Representatives broke into smaller groups in the corridors and did the real negotiating that formal sessions were too public to contain. Voices were lower in the corridors and more honest. People said things like, "We cannot pull the algorithm without taking down 6 relay nodes and the Section 3 figures. Have your people check them against mortality records." And once, from an aide who thought he was speaking only to a colleague and was not, "They counted our dead for us. Those are real numbers. They actually went and counted." The session reconvened. Avaharan was about to call the room to order when the main chamber doors opened. They opened from the outside, the wrong direction. Visitors and observers entered from side corridors. The main doors were council entry only, sealed during sessions by security locks that required council-issued command clearance to release. Someone had released them. Every head in the chamber turned. Yara Osa walked in. She was dressed the same way she had been dressed the day she signed the compact dark jacket, no medals, no ceremonial anything. She was carrying a battered steel flask and a notebook. She looked like someone who had walked into the wrong meeting and decided to stay anyway. She did not stop at the threshold. She walked across the main floor, past the presiding seat where Avaharan sat with 4 arms no longer folded but very still, past the center table, all the way to the observer tier. She sat in the vassal chair. The chair in the lowest observer position. The one labeled vassal observer in 6 languages. The one that had been empty all session, its emptiness noted, its significance already the subject of more than one corridor whisper. She sat in it, unscrewed the cap on her flask, and took a slow drink of whatever was inside. Water, as it turned out, just water. She set the flask on the armrest and looked up at the chamber, not at any one representative, at the room itself. The way you look at something you have been studying for a long time and are now standing inside. Avaharan found her voice first. "Ambassador Osai," she said, in a tone that was keeping several other tones carefully contained. "This session is closed to observer-tier attendance. You do not have access to this chamber during an emergency." "I know," Yara said. She said it pleasantly. "I apologize for the intrusion. I thought it might save time." "How did you access the main entry?" "The door system runs on the relay network," she said. "I filed an emergency access request through the standard maintenance override channel. It was approved automatically. A beat. You may want to look at that process." The silence in the chamber was a different quality now, not the silence of people waiting for an argument to resolve. the silence of people in the middle of realizing something. "I'm not here to make demands," Yara said. She opened her notebook. The cheap ballpoint pen appeared from her jacket pocket. "I'm here because we said we'd resume communications in 48 hours and I believe in being on time." She looked at Avaharan. "We'd like to discuss revised terms, when you're ready." She uncapped her pen. She waited. Nobody told her to leave. That, more than anything, was the thing that Avaharan would remember afterward. The long chamber, the full tiers, 41 species and their representatives and their aides and their security personnel and their centuries of accumulated authority, and not one of them told the human ambassador to leave. Some of them, she suspected, had wanted to. The Velhari certainly had, but the door had opened with a command filed through a system they had built. The vassal chair she was sitting in was a designation they had created, and the notebook she had set on the armrest was the same notebook, the same physical notebook, small and slightly worn at the corners, that she had written in on the day she signed the provisional compact. You could tell her to leave, but you would be doing it in a room that was, in some ways she had very carefully arranged, already partly hers. Avaharan made a decision. It was not the decision her security directorate would have preferred, and it was not the decision that the Velhari would have preferred, and it was not, if she was being honest, the decision that pure procedure demanded. But it was the decision that the situation had maneuvered her toward, and she had enough experience to recognize when a situation had been carefully maneuvered. "This session is recessed," she said, "pending informal consultation." She looked at Yara Osai. 15 minutes. 15 minutes became 4 hours. They met in one of the smaller consultation rooms off the main corridor, the ones used for sensitive bilateral discussions, with good sound barriers and a table sized for 8. Yara came alone. The council sent Avaharan, the Sathari representative Soliveth, and at Yara's specific prior request, Yos Thurin of the Harathi, who had been the first person in the chamber to say out loud what everyone was thinking. Yara set the flask on the table. She set the notebook beside it. She did not open either. "I want to be direct," she said, "because I think we're all tired of not being direct." No one disagreed. "We're not here to dismantle the council," she said. "We're not here to retaliate for the compact. We're not even here to embarrass anyone, though I understand this week has been uncomfortable and I'm sorry for that." She paused. "A little sorry." Yos Thurin, oldest person in the room and possibly the oldest in the building, made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Earth's position," Yara continued, "is this. We have spent 14 months learning how this institution works. We have read more of your documentation than most of your full members have. We understand the relay infrastructure better than the team that maintains it. We have relationships in 17 secondary markets that your trade networks don't reach. And we have, in the last 72 hours, demonstrated that we can move inside your systems without your awareness, which is not a threat. It is a fact, and I want it on the table as a fact, not as something we're dancing around." Soliveth's feathers moved, gray to a pale blue at the edges, paying close attention. "We don't want vassal status," Yara said. "We don't want to be corrected or managed or developed. We want full membership, immediate access to the technology tiers currently restricted to protected species. The Section 3 items addressed all of them, all 12 conditions, with a funded implementation timeline, and a seat on the Infrastructure Committee." Avaharan said, "The Infrastructure Committee does not accept members below second-tier standing." "I know," Yara said. "You'll want to change that." A pause. "The relay algorithm," she said, "stays in place. We're not pulling it, we're not using it as a weapon. It runs your system and your system should work. But we want the intellectual property recognized. We want a licensing arrangement that is fair and documented, and we want it handled properly rather than ignored and litigated into a problem later." She looked around the table. "We would like to be good members. We would like to cooperate. We are very good at cooperating." You have seen 14 months of evidence of how good we are at cooperating. Yos Thurin spoke. Her voice had the particular quietness of someone who has made peace with surprises. Your Section 3 list, she said. The mortality figures, your team compiled those themselves. We compiled them from publicly available council medical records and our own mortality data, Yara said. The matching was done by a team of 4 people over 3 months. The numbers have been peer-reviewed internally. We believe them to be accurate within a small margin. Why that section? Yos Thurin said. The infrastructure claims the intellectual property, those are leverage. The mortality figures are not leverage. You cannot sue someone for deaths that happened under a legal compact. The room was quiet. No, Yara said, you can't. She didn't explain further. She let the silence sit the way the document had let those page-and-a-half of names and numbers sit, plain, uncommented, carrying its own weight. Yos Thurin looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Avaharan. Avaharan looked at the table. The negotiation lasted 3 days. It was not always calm. The Velhari sent a representative on the second day who spent 4 hours arguing about the relay algorithm and the precedent it would set, and what it would mean for how observer-period technology exchanges were handled going forward. He was not wrong about any of it. Yara let him finish. Then she said that those were all good points, and she looked forward to working through them on the Infrastructure Committee, if his delegation would like to submit an agenda item. He left. He came back the next morning with a counter-proposal. The Harathi mediated. They were good at it. They had been full members for long enough to be trusted by both the Old Guard and the representatives who were starting to understand that Old Guard might need adjusting. On the evening of the 3rd day, 4 items were agreed. Full membership for Earth, effective 60 days from signing, with standard ratification procedures waived on grounds of demonstrated operational integration with Council infrastructure. Access to all technology tiers, with the Section 3 list addressed under a funded 10-year health implementation program. Formal licensing recognition for the relay algorithm, and 5 other pieces of intellectual property identified in the document's addendum, and a seat on the Infrastructure Committee. Avaharan signed the revised agreement. Yara signed it with the cheap ballpoint pen. The oldest member of the Galactic Council was not present for the signing. Elder Ori Tessavan of the Drun had been a council member for 612 years. He had been present for the admission of 11 species to full membership, the suspension of 3, and 1 dissolution that had ended in armed conflict that nobody called a war but which had cost 400,000 lives across 2 systems. He had seen empires consider themselves permanent and then become historical footnotes. He had a particular quality that very old things sometimes had, the ability to be unsurprised while also being fully present. He was watching the signing ceremony on a feed in his private office. When Yara Osai capped her pen and the chamber registered the applause of 41 delegations, formal, a little awkward, the sound of a room recalibrating itself. He allowed himself to make the sound that had almost escaped him during the session 4 days ago. He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. A Drun laugh uses all 4 shoulders, and his aide, who had worked for him for 30 years and had heard the polite version many times, looked up from his own desk with visible surprise. Elder, I should have read their history, Ori Tessavan said. We had access to it, their full recorded history, before the first contact team even landed. You read a summary, his aide said. I read a summary. He looked at the feed. Yara Osai was shaking hands with Avaharan, or the Drun equivalent, which involved a brief press of foreheads that she performed without hesitation, which meant she had practiced it, which meant she had been preparing for this moment specifically. A summary, written by our analysts, who noted they were procedurally sophisticated but strategically naive. He looked at his aide. Do you know what that species did for the first 200,000 years of their existence? His aide said nothing. They competed with each other, Oritesavan said, constantly, for food, territory, resources, influence. They had no natural defenses, no claws, no armor, no venom. They were not the fastest thing in their environment or the strongest. They survived by learning everything about the things that could kill them and then removing every advantage those things had. He watched the feed. They called it strategy. We called it naive. His aide looked at the feed. The relay algorithm, Oritesavan said more quietly, the door, the document format, the Section 3 figures with no commentary. He was quiet for a moment. She did not threaten us once, not a single sentence that could be read as a threat. She simply showed us exactly what they had done and waited for us to understand what it meant. Is that worse? His aide asked. Oritesavan thought about it. It's more permanent, he said. You can defend against a threat. You cannot defend against someone making themselves necessary. On the feed, Yara Osai stepped away from the signing table and walked toward the corridor, and she passed, on her way, the vassal chair, empty now, just a chair, its label already in the process of being reviewed for removal. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She was already working on what came next. Her notebook was open. The cheap ballpoint pen moved across a page. And from the angle of the feed, there was no reading what she was writing. There never had been.